I have a Patreon. I've had one for a while, but over the last few months, I've begun to release exclusive videos on there, such as How the Incels Found American Psycho, which is an analysis of how a movie that's so critical of the Patrick Batemans of the world could result in an entire subculture worshipping Patrick Bateman. We also just released How Napoleon Dynamite Took the Edge Out of the Indie Movie, which is about why Napoleon Dynamite was as popular as it was, and how it differs from the indie loser movies that came before it. By subscribing to my Patreon, you're not only getting exclusive bonus videos, you're also supporting this channel and our ability to keep producing incisive, high-quality work. So if these videos interest you, go support us at patreon.com/broedeschanel for exclusive videos, early access to our regular programming, updates, and input about video topics. See you there. This video was made in partnership with Balesa. Warning, this video contains spoilers for 1917, All Quiet on the Western Front, Come and See, Warfare, and Grave of the Fireflies. I'm providing time codes for these spoilers, so if you don't want a movie spoiled for you, you can just refer to this and skip ahead. Singer Edwin Starr once asked, "War, what is it good for?" And apparently, if my records are correct, it's for making really good movies. Confession. I like war movies. Before ever writing this video, I had seen tons of them. War movies, war shows, war games. World War II was one of my favorite subjects in high school. That being said, I don't like war. In fact, I hate it, obviously. But there's something about war movies. Maybe it's the stakes, maybe it's the adrenaline, the historical detail, or if I'm being entirely honest with myself, maybe just sheer morbidity, that I find extremely engaging. The most recent war movie to hit our screens is Alex Garland's newest feature, Warfare, which was marketed with the gimmick that it was a real-time depiction of a mission during the Iraq War, and tells the real story of a platoon attempting to carry out a casualty evacuation, or CASEVAC, when their mission goes awry and some of their comrades are killed or horribly maimed. Warfare is based on the experiences of its co-director, Raine Mendoza, and has been widely lauded for what critics found to be an unprecedentedly authentic depiction of battle. But the movie has also been widely criticized by some audiences for being pro-war propaganda. That no matter how viscerally brutal or true-to-life warfare may be, directors Alex Garland and Mendoza are still carrying out an imperialist project. As the film's top review, only 2 stars on Letterboxd, reads, "Warfare's real offense is its implication as a story about bravery and heroism." After all, the film ends with a rousing montage of photos of the real members of the Alpha 1 SEAL platoon, cut with footage of some of the veterans helping out on set. An homage to their bravery, it seems. War films have all but dominated the zeitgeist for as long as film has existed. Their momentous scale, cathartic narratives, and dramatic emotional performances have made them an easy shortcut to the award circuit, as the Oscars have proven time and time again. So much of the backlash towards Warfare stems from a place of, we're not making another war film, are we? And beyond general boredom with the genre, the sentiment is also guided by an overarching feeling that it's impossible to make a film that is truly against war. Francois Truffaut captured this feeling in 1973 when he said, "Every film about war ends up being pro-war." Controversially, I think war movies can still be really good movies. Many of them are some of the best movies ever made. But being effectively anti-war is another story altogether. It's a problem of adrenaline, of conflicting interest and empathy, and of a really beautiful image. But people say that no film about war can be anti-war, and I'd venture that, like all things, it's much more complicated than that. Of course, some movies are just straight up pro-war, state-sanctioned propaganda designed to encourage people to enlist in the army and trot out to battle. So we can separate those films from the pile. Many of the best war movies out there are attempting, to some degree, to put forth an anti-war message. I don't think Warfare is necessarily propaganda in and of itself, But with certain well-intentioned choices, it runs the risk of forgoing whatever critical message about war it sets out to send. Such is the dilemma of a lot of these attempted anti-war movies, which ultimately invites the question, what is the goal of an anti-war film? Is it to dissuade us from joining the military? Is it to turn us against the military or the people who start wars? To honor the lives lost in conflict or the causes they fought for or became victims of? To end war forever? In many ways, the question of the war film, what is its purpose, what is it good for, can be tied to any artistic depictions of war, whether through literature, photography, painting, or other artistic mediums. The question that still haunts all of these pursuits is, to some degree, the same, and echoes a question Virginia Woolf once posed, that Susan Sontag reflected on in her own work on war photography. That question being, how, in your opinion, are we to prevent war? Not all wars are created equal. War has also existed for millennia, and war film is not a genre unto itself. You can have an action movie, a psychological horror, or a spy thriller all within that same category. That's an incredibly broad subject, which makes any general statement about war films pretty difficult to exact. So I'm taking this opportunity to look at war movies that have been made over the past century and ask a very pressing question. Does the anti-war film exist? The most common rebuttal to the idea of an anti-war film is that, in their attempts at immersion, war movies often create a lustful image of violence, one that plays upon a morbid impulse in the viewer. Basically, the problem is sensationalism. More often than not, a narrative film has to tell, well, a narrative, a story. And often these stories need a beginning, middle, and end, which means they require momentum, stakes, and catharsis to keep the audience engaged. This is what makes war films feel so adrenaline pumping. You're right there in the action with characters you care about, and so you're feeling the stakes along with them. Take Sam Mendes's 1917, for example. The film, released in 2019, follows two lance corporals in World War I who were tasked with delivering a message to another battalion to call off an attack that would cost the lives of many Allied soldiers. 1917, alongside other war films, tends to fall into the trap of the cathartic ending. Told from the side of the victors, the Allies, these films carry the viewer through a world of impossible odds and emotional intensity, where the characters they've come to root for engage in combat and narrowly escape death. It's through this intensity, through the sheer impossibility of their undertaking, that catharsis is born. The viewers watch with open mouths as these heroes accomplish their mission, and the film ends on a bittersweet, if not relieving, tone. 1917 is far from being the first film about the World Wars. However, like Warfare, its uniqueness was marketed with a gimmick, being that the whole film looks as though it was shot in 2 long takes. While the technological marvel of this is not to be discounted, there are numerous famed, what appear to be long shot scenes in war films, the most notable being Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. The popularity of the long take within war films is due to the flexibility of the shot's effect. It can present scale by following the heroes through the vastness of battlefields, or create disorientation and claustrophobia by huddling down with the characters in confined spaces. When used for the entirety of the film, however, it creates an almost video game-like effect, fully immersing the viewers in the spectacle and cathartic success of their hero's journey. And it's this immersion, this feeling that all violence has a payoff, that harms the anti-war message. All Quiet on the Western Front, a 2022 adaptation of Erich Maria Remarque's groundbreaking novel, which was banned by the Nazis in World War II for its explicit anti-war stance, takes the opposite approach. The film, set in World War I, follows a soldier named Paul Baumer who fights in the Imperial German Army, the losing side. The actors in this movie, as opposed to other war movies, look alarmingly young, highlighting just how impressionable many of these boys really were, how easy it was for them to fall for propaganda. Director Edward Berger made the film overtly political by adding in a subplot about high-ranking German officials and their ambivalence towards the lives they were expending. The movie begins with the POV of another German soldier who dies on the front lines, only for the army to remove his uniform and recycle it to an unknowing Paul, showing that to their government, these soldiers are interchangeable. A conscription-based war, Paul and his comrades are woefully undertrained, and with some graphic hand-to-hand combat, we watch in horror as they're sent out again and again to fight a losing battle, until Paul alone is left, completely weathered and psychologically eviscerated, before being forced out again, despite the morale among his troops being entirely broken. Unlike 1917, All Quiet on the Western Front does not end with any sense of accomplishment, but instead with Paul going out this final time only to be killed minutes before a ceasefire is called. As the credits roll, all you're left with is a feeling of senselessness and despair. Your spirit is broken for these boys, who lost every shred of their humanity only to die for a country that doesn't care about them. There is no glory here. But is the film truly anti-war? In an episode about warfare for the New Yorker podcast, Critics at Large, Naomi Fry, Vincent Cunningham, and Alexandra Schwartz host something of a salon about the war film and its goals. Schwartz talks about Claire Denis' film Beau Travail, which doesn't take place during wartime, but is about soldiers from the French Foreign Legion who were stationed in Djibouti. Schwartz finds it interesting that Denis is so preoccupied with what she refers to as male bodies in motion together. She remarks, "Director after director after director keeps noticing that there is something dance-like in what these guys are doing that makes it both extremely beautiful and, because that contrasts to what their activity is about, terrible." I think generally, part of what makes so many war movies some of the most legendary films of all time is the power of their images. And added with that element of momentum, this can have a really strong effect on the way the viewer receives the violence they're watching. All Quiet on the Western Front is very obviously critical of war. But this film won Best Cinematography at the Oscars for a reason. Its hyper HD battle scenes are so expertly choreographed and filmed to convey a sort of violent trance that Paul enters into when he's in battle. This is not the boy we've come to know, but a killing machine. Because on the front lines, it's kill or be killed. This trance builds and builds through the battles so that it can be interrupted, when Paul mercilessly kills a French soldier lying in a crater and stuffs dirt in his mouth to stifle the sounds of his screams. It's a pivotal moment in the film, when we see Paul's humanity flood back into him as he realizes what he's done. I watched the entire scene with my mouth hanging open. But to get to this, it means we've had to follow Paul along through these hypnotic battle sequences, watching him avoid death by the skin of his teeth. And during these moments, you do feel the adrenaline. If there is something dance-like to what these soldiers are doing, we can think of war as a sort of horrible theater, bodies and choreography dancing towards death. So while we're appalled by the desperate measures that Paul must take in order to survive, we're also entranced by them, as you would be by a beautiful image, an expertly constructed sculpture, or a stirring melody. We're immersed in it, swept away by it, and as Bertolt Brecht famously claimed, one cannot be critical of art when you are simply a passive observer along for the ride. So All Quiet feels much more bleak in tone than Saving Private Ryan or 1917, but just like them, you still get swept up in the power of its cinematography and stakes. And so All Quiet on the Western Front comes inches away from being an anti-war film, but even it cannot avoid sensationalism. Francis Ford Coppola's 1979 masterpiece, Apocalypse Now, also appears to be an anti-war film. It belongs to a host of movies that were made about the Vietnam War by a more countercultural Hollywood, and isn't so much an action film as 1917 or Saving Private Ryan, as it is a psychological thriller. The war in Vietnam was a wildly unpopular one, even at its time, and is seen to be a major blight upon American history. And this is very much echoed in Apocalypse Now. It begins with a beautiful shot of a serene jungle slowly going up in flames. Its protagonist is a reclusive, psychologically unstable soldier named Benjamin Willard, who is sent on a mission to kill the rogue Colonel Walter Kurtz, a la Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The deaths of Benjamin's comrades feel more eerie than sad, and the entire third act in Kurtz's remote, lawless outpost has you wondering whether this movie is about people who lose their sanity from the horrors of war, or whether the people horrified by war are the only sane people to begin with. The film is also forthcoming in its depiction of the American military and their reprehensible acts overseas. Vietnamese civilians are hunted for sport and killed wantonly. In what's perhaps the most iconic scene from the film, a squadron sets out on a napalm raid. As the soldiers play Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries loudly from the helicopter speakers, we cut to children in a peaceful schoolyard and farmers in the field hard at work, just moments away from their worlds being torn inside out as the helicopters, one reading death from above, ride overhead and gleefully drop bombs upon them. Coppola is obviously spotlighting the brutish cruelty of the American troops, juxtaposing their casualness from the safety of their helicopters with the absolute horrors taking place below. So it shocked people when Coppola said in a 2019 interview that Apocalypse Now is not an anti-war film. He said that an anti-war film should be a movie filled with love and peace and tranquility and happiness, the beauty of life. Continuing, it shouldn't have sequences of violence that inspire a lust for violence. Apocalypse Now has stirring scenes of helicopters attacking innocent people. That's not anti-war. And it's true that to some, that Ride of the Valkyries scene was stirring. Author and veteran Anthony Swafford has said that he and his fellow Marines were shown Apocalypse Now to hype them up in preparation for Operation Desert Storm. He writes, "The magic brutality of war films celebrates the terrible and despicable beauty of the soldiers' fighting skills. Fight, war, pillage, burn. Filmic images of death and carnage are pornography for the military man." The scene is all spectacle. So ultimately, try as they might, the filmmakers of All Quiet on the Western Front and Apocalypse Now were unable to detract audiences from the terrible beauty of the violence they see before them. Swafford's own memoir was adapted into the 2005 film Jarhead, directed again by Sam Mendes. And while it stays faithful to Swafford's sentiment that sensational imagery can be rousing for viewers, featuring little to no violence or even combat at all, it still fumbles in its anti-war message. At one point in the Critics at Large episode, Fry posits that one of the central questions of the war film is whether a group of disparate people can become a band of brothers. This is certainly the case for most films about war. Especially in movies about conscription-based wars, we find ourselves wondering how a bunch of random men thrown into a foreign environment and placed into constant survival mode could possibly get along. So often, the stories become about the relationships forged among these men, and the possibility of having them torn apart in combat. As Schwartz observes about warfare, all the baggage that I brought started to transform once the action really began. You're plunged into this crazy situation of survival, but it's also more than survival. Codependence. Because that's what war is about, and it's also what the whole human game is about. This brotherhood element comprises a significant portion of the emotional stakes in these movies, but again, may weaken their anti-war messaging. Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket is easily one of his best films, and that's a bold claim given the caliber of his filmography. It's a very political film. Set during the Vietnam War, its first half is spent at a grueling Marine training camp where soldiers are subjected to frequent emotional and psychological abuse from their ruthless drill instructor, Sergeant Hartman, which takes a particular toll on less hardened trainees like the gentle giant Leonard Lawrence. The goal of this training is to sculpt our soldiers into killing machines and eradicate whatever humanity they came in with. But it would be a rather boring story if we followed one of these killing machines into war, like if the cold-blooded animal mother were to be our protagonist. So instead we follow the quick-witted Joker, surrogate for the film's screenwriter Gustav Hasford, a journalist and Vietnam vet. Through Joker's critical eyes, we become critical of the action too. And because the training failed to eradicate the human in Joker, we spent the movie watching him make rebellious quips and forming close relationships with other soldiers like Cowboy. The second half of the movie, arguably its weaker half, we spend in battle with Joker, Cowboy, and Cowboy's unit as they traverse the difficulties of guerrilla warfare against the Viet Cong. And while Kubrick makes no attempts to disguise the soldiers' paternalism and even overt racism,
you know what really pisses me off about these people? We're supposed to be helping them and they shit all over us every chance they get.
Well, at least they died for a good cause.
What cause was that?
Freedom?
After we rotate back to the world, we're gonna miss not having anyone around who's worth shooting.
Through the eyes of Joker, who we've grown to care about over the course of the film, we can't help but root for them, or grieve when one of them is killed, positioning us against their enemy, even when that enemy is revealed to be a little girl. The soldiers, backdropped with sexy rock music from the era, hard-bodied, decorated with machine gun links and bespoke helmets that they made themselves, and eased into their subtropical surroundings, ultimately look kind of cool. Although Joker's spirit seems to be somewhat broken by the end of the film, there is little emphasis on the psychic toll of being in the military once we leave training camp. We haven't been with the more callous members of the platoon, so we don't see them lose their humanity. To us, they never had it to begin with. And even under the brutal thumb of Hartman and his military apparatus, we see that tenderness between the soldiers, like Joker, Cowboy, and Lawrence, cannot be broken. While soldiers do form important connections with one another, this major theme of fraternal camaraderie can result in an inadvertent pro-military stance, regardless of whether that movie is necessarily pro-war, and regardless of how that movie even depicts the military, which is pretty negative here. Platoon takes a more emotional approach. Directed by Vietnam vet Oliver Stone, the movie is sympathetic to the men who ended up fighting in Vietnam, many of whom were conscripted. These men are considered the dregs of America.
They're poor, they're the unwanted, yet they're fighting for our society and our freedom. They're the best I've ever seen, Grandma. The heart and soul.
Poor always being f***ed over by the rich. Always have, always will.
And we see how the draft places a great strain on the efficiency of their fighting. Our protagonist, Chris Taylor, is similar to Joker in his sensitivity and criticality. He is an outsider to these men in that he is higher class and is also enlisted. But Taylor, along with the other men in his platoon, are largely incompetent, because they're fighting an ill-defined war with no clear end in sight. Stone explores how poor organization within the American military at this time led to infighting among soldiers.
We did not fight the enemy. We fought ourselves. And the enemy was in us.
There is a clear schism in Taylor's platoon between the more bohemian faction led by Sergeant Elias and the more thuggish faction led by the psychopathic Sergeant Barnes. Adapting to an unfamiliar fighting style and guided by leaders with conflicting approaches to combat, the fighting in Platoon is indiscriminate and directionless, and the lack of direction or clear motive begins to affect the psyches of the soldiers.
Now, I got no fight with any man that does what he's told, and when he don't, the machine breaks down. And when the machine breaks down, we break down.
Such that they begin to take their frustrations out on innocent civilians. In one of the most upsetting scenes in cinema, our platoon pillages a village in search of alleged NVA informants who may have killed some of their comrades. They brutally murder several villagers, including an elderly woman and a disabled young man. The shots of the young man's mother and the woman's child daughter as they stare blankly at the carnage, clearly dead inside, are ones you'll never forget. But there are still moments of camaraderie among the different factions in the platoon. And again, you feel the loss when soldiers you come to like are killed. The movie's climax, as Taylor and the surviving members of the platoon hide in foxholes during a bombardment, once again has you more worried for the safety of Taylor and the other soldiers, members of an imperial army, than you do for the Vietnamese. As you fly away with Taylor in the helicopter, you feel a sense of relief that at least he made it out alive. Platoon ends with the dedication to the men who fought in Vietnam, but not to the Vietnamese civilians who lost everything. These two movies are incredible, but in aligning us with imperial soldiers, they risk creating an enemy out of the oppressed, give us a motive to get back at the people who killed our comrades. On the other hand, Jarhead questions what happens to a group of disparate men who, as opposed to most war movies, don't have the threat of combat or the question of survival to distract them. Based on Swofford's memoir, Jarhead tells the story of Tony, who, feeling lost and inspired by the bravery of his veteran father, enlists as a Marine and is deployed to fight as a sniper in the Gulf War. But rather than being about the terror or excitement of combat, the movie is about the psychological toll of not being able to fight, as Tony and his fellow Marines never actually experience battle.
We throw hand grenades into nowhere.
Instead, they spend long days at base camp training, throwing destructive parties, fighting amongst themselves, and growing increasingly paranoid about the fidelity of their wives and girlfriends. Like Platoon, this listlessness and lack of motive makes them terribly inefficient and insubordinate. Jarhead bears a likeness to Nico Walker's 2018 novel Cherry, in that it spends no time valorizing these Marines. They are not noble knights out to save their country, but instead crass and deeply insecure Nimrods. As in Cherry, the military institution exacerbates their crassness. Hands are dick skinners and mouths are receptacles. This is actually a common trait among war films. Many of the ones discussed in this video mince no words about the soldiers' real attitudes overseas.
I'll skip the foreplay.
But unlike Joker or Taylor, we aren't given anyone to root for here. Tony is just as much a dirtbag as his comrades. The film does not shy away from politics either, exposing how the American military coerced its soldiers into lying to the press about what they were up to, even when the men call this practice un-American. Unlike so many other films about the wars in Iraq, Jarhead actually mentions the political figures involved in the Gulf War by name.
The government of dictator Saddam Hussein.
President Bush sends in more troops.
And it shows the Marines at training camp cheering on the napalm scene in Apocalypse Now, completely missing the message of the film. But ultimately, even Jarhead does not avoid the fraternal camaraderie. It begins with a playful sequence in which Tony is hazed by his fellow trainees to the tune of "Don't worry, be happy," and develops the different soldiers as distinctive characters, all with their own baggage and quirks, which sometimes causes friction between them and other times bonds them to one another. This bond is especially strong between Tony and Corporal Alan Troy, whose friendship becomes the emotional anchor for the film. Cherry highlights the total absurdity of the later Iraq War, outright telling the reader not to join the army, saying that the soldiers were not heroes, but rather simply the help, and sardonically making light of the monotonous day-to-day missions that resulted in senseless bloodshed, which is extremely graphic in the book. Whereas in Jarhead, with such a heavy focus on the stymieing of the soldiers' ability to fight, and the torture of wondering whether their girlfriends are being unfaithful, which is proven several times in the film to be correct, Jarhead takes a pretty empathetic approach to the idea of emasculation. So when Tony and Alan are finally given the chance to kill two high-ranking members of the Iraqi Republican Guard, but are thwarted at the last minute, you as the viewer experience the same feelings of frustration that they do. You understand why Troy, with nothing left for him back home, has a mental breakdown. Because fighting is the elusive dream for these soldiers, it takes on a meaning that should not be present in a film about American interventionism, especially when considering the sequel war undertaken by Bush's son that was taking place when Jarhead came out. In a review for The Guardian, James Meek points out the commonalities between Jarhead and Platoon and Full Metal Jacket, saying that this is its message. Less pity the world that has war visited upon it, more pity the poor soldier. It's more to do with how a group of young American men party, quarrel, bitch, brawl, boast, pose, amuse themselves, and bond in an intimate group facing danger than about the wider impact of war on families, civilians, or the world at large. While Full Metal Jacket ends with the war raging on, our soldiers still in its midst, and All Quiet ends with our protagonist dying, Platoon and Jarhead end with our soldiers going home. Meek sees this as a betrayal of the anti-war message, that if our protagonist leaves the battlefield uninjured and sane, and we see little of what becomes of his life after the war, the movie is diminished as a film which says something about war, and it becomes a simpler story of growing up, of jeopardy overcome. You could argue that the trap of these films is in the basic principles of good storytelling, that satisfying Hollywood arc which requires compelling characters and relationships. It doesn't always have to be a happy ending, though. Sometimes, like All Quiet, it ends with our soldier dying. Sometimes, war movies even end with our soldier willingly returning to the battlefield. Many war movies that pity the poor soldier are about lost souls who are stuck in the psychological limbo of war, like American Sniper or The Hurt Locker, who hate it on the fields but also seem to hate it back at home where they're lonely and purposeless, and thus yearn to go back into combat. When it comes down to it, movies are, as Roger Ebert put it, empathy machines. A film can attempt to be as critical and political as possible, but when it's told from the point of view of an imperial soldier who you come to root for, and whose experience of battle is often filmed through actual POV shots, where he aims his weapon at the opposing side, who by virtue of this are automatically positioned as the enemy, we can't help but empathize with them, no matter their cause. When you pity the poor soldier, political anti-war messaging risks going out the window, especially in films about wars like Vietnam and Iraq. And when camaraderie comes into the picture and you feel the threat of losing your protagonist or his comrades, that pro-military get the enemy message is kind of hard to avoid. And this has its consequences. I don't think many of these directors are factoring in the psyche of the young male viewer, who's still developing prefrontal cortex makes him worse at decision-making and prone to risky behaviors. When he first watched Full Metal Jacket, for example, Marine veteran James Clark immediately enlisted, specifically citing that iconic intro sequence of Hartman hurling abuse at the trainees as his inspiration. He said, "As a kid who grew up relatively coddled in a Bay Area, California suburb, it also felt a little bit like a dare. Could I deal with that?" And especially now, during what they're calling a male loneliness epidemic in our increasingly fragmented society, young men are looking for something to hold on to. For something real, community, purpose, drive, distinction. It's an unfortunate reality of our times that the military is one of the final vestiges of belonging. Regardless of the inhumane conditions these men are forced into, it's been found that many veterans come back with positive memories of their times in the Army. This has plagued PTSD researchers for decades, as they discover that veterans are much less able to release and heal their trauma due to the positives they also associate with that trauma. Anthropologist Sebastian Junger observes in a study about post-war PTSD, structurally, a band of hunter-gatherers and a platoon in combat are almost exactly the same. In each case, the group numbers between 60 and 50 individuals. They sleep in a common area, they conduct patrols, they are completely reliant on one another for support, comfort, and defense, and they share a group identity that most would risk their lives for. Personal interest is subsumed into group interest because personal survival is not possible without group survival. From an evolutionary perspective, it's not at all surprising that many soldiers respond to combat in positive ways and miss it when it's gone. The reason that Brotherhood becomes such a crucial theme in war movies about soldiers is that while they're in the military, they feel that they belong, that they're a part of a tribe of sorts that moves cohesively and fluidly as one, bodies and choreography. It's when they come home to an inherently alienating and de-ritualized society that their troubles from trauma have been found to arise, suddenly lacking the community and support that they had overseas. So from a psychological and anthropological standpoint, it's pretty complicated. Not all soldiers are created equal. Many are genuinely racist, misogynistic, imperialistic, and bloodthirsty. But I generally have empathy for the people who go to war, both conscriptees and those who enlist, often either because they fall for propaganda or because their home countries have created an environment where joining the military and even going to war feels like the safest or most fulfilling option. So I don't think war movies should necessarily depict every soldier as a cold-blooded, inhuman killing machine, because that would be dishonest. It would also be dishonest to leave out the aspect of camaraderie. But empathy for the soldier can often justify the existence of the military for what it does for these men, which, while they aren't the same thing, is hard to separate from a justification of war. So it becomes a dilemma for the filmmaker to toe the line between empathy for the soldier and being critical of imperialism and the military-industrial complex. In a film about soldiers, that line feels nearly impossible.
Devoid of Hollywood grammar, no score, no fictionalization, like a very literal, apolitical, and objective recreation of real events. I was all in.
A big theme in the making of war movies are testimonies from cast and crew about the authenticity of film shoots, that actors were put through rigorous training and placed in brutal living conditions to extract an authentic performance from them. On the film's press tour, Mendoza spoke extensively about this very commitment to authenticity during the filming of Warfare, citing that he has never felt seen by war movies in general, because they fail to accurately depict military culture and the experience of war. He viewed the making of Warfare as something of a therapeutic process, and at one point had to walk off set to collect himself because the environment they had recreated was so viscerally similar to the one that he had experienced. Warfare is a visceral movie. Everything from lighting, sound, performance, and costuming is designed to overwhelm you as the soldiers navigate their way out of an increasingly dire situation. And it makes no attempt to explain to you what's going on, instead opting to have the soldiers mumble to each other in real military language. The film is not so much a narrative. We don't really get to know the characters, and there's little setup or payoff to any of the action. It's just utter chaos. The violence is also extremely graphic. Once Sniper Elliot and Petty Officer Sam are horribly injured, their screams are unrelenting. We get no reprieve from their agony, as the film is in real time, and their screams overwhelm the rest of the action as well, causing the other soldiers to dissociate completely.
Dude, I'm fucked up.
The instigating moment where the bomb goes off and everything goes silent is when you realize how futile this all is. Again, no glory. Warfare begins with a title card about the Navy SEALs that reads, "This film uses only their memories." And you can see how Garland and Mendoza were effective here. Those hyper-immersive elements like sound, for example, are used to situate the viewer right inside that moment. Narrative was not needed to achieve this goal, because as renowned psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk explains in his book about trauma, The Body Keeps the Score, the imprints of traumatic experiences are organized not as coherent, logical narratives, but in fragmented sensory and emotional traces, images, sounds, and physical sensations. The result is certainly horrifying. You, the viewer, are flailing through every little detail thrown at you to the point of experiencing sensory overload. And Mendoza has clarified that no one should come away from the film thinking that war is a good thing, but he's also maintained that the film is not political. He said, "Warfare isn't meant to fit into some political box. There's not a lot of narrative for a reason. It's for you to fill in the blanks," suggesting that a filmmaker should not shoulder the responsibility of how their audience will receive the action of a film. Essentially, with the lack of narrative and so-called non-political stance, he and Garland are attempting objectivity. But is objectivity even possible? Memory is used in the film as a means of showing proof of the horrors of war, of forcing the audience to bear witness to the events in Iraq. And people will defend criticisms of Warfare by saying that with all the authenticity of the timing, sets, and dialogue, the film is just true to memory, almost like a war photograph. This, of course, is done to avoid glorifying war. But in one of my favorite texts of all time regarding the pain of others, Susan Sontag takes issue with the war photograph and its claims of objectivity, truth. She says, "Photographs have the advantage of uniting two contradictory features. Their credentials of objectivity were inbuilt, yet they always had, necessarily, a point of view." For Sontag, the mere fact that someone is standing behind the camera, that a photograph is authored, makes it subjective. There are certain choices being made by the photographer, framing, distance, composition, lighting, that complicate the claim that a photograph tells the truth. Many wartime photographers attempt to let their image speak for themselves, but in doing so, they remove important historical and political context that informs the image. There is always extra information lying beyond the four walls of the photograph, something we're not seeing. Says Sontag, "It is always the image that someone chose. To photograph is to frame, and to frame is to exclude." And what does Warfare exclude? Well, in choosing to focus on a single platoon, on a single day, in a certain house from the specific point of view of Mendoza's surrogate Ray, an American, the movie adopts that very pity the poor soldier approach, and thus leaves out a very important point of view in the Iraq War: actual Iraqis. The Iraqis depicted in the film are insurgent fighters, a family who lives in the house that the American soldiers overtake, and two translators working with the SEALs. The family is almost never seen. Their yells are often literally muted by the sound design. They are peripheral. For all the work the movie does to separate itself from other war films, The insurgent fighters are portrayed no differently than other slop about the Iraq War. They're shady, shrouded individuals standing on neighboring roofs and running about the streets, framed often from inside the gun of a sniper. We again spend no time with them. And then the Iraqis we do spend time with, translators Noor and Farid, become the film's only victims, as Farid is blown to smithereens, his body the only dead body we see in terrible detail. For the rest of the film, his leg lays lamely in the middle of the street amidst all the action. The film ends with a shot of the insurgents coming out of their hiding places to inspect it. Farid becomes nothing more than a body, completely dehumanized. In its framing choices, the film chooses to leave out the political context of the war, that this country was wrongfully invaded, its political system overturned, and its civilians brutalized for close to a decade. Iraq still has not recovered from the devastation. It also leaves out brutality among the American soldiers. In Cherry, Nico Walker depicts this really effectively. Soldiers taunting impoverished children and shooting dogs for sport. But like most films about Iraq, none of that is present in Warfare. So the question is not whether warfare is authentic, but to whom is it authentic? Likely, it's authentic to American veterans and soldiers who may feel that their trauma is represented and can get a kick out of the military experience being depicted correctly. But it's by no means the full picture. In its pursuit of objectivity, Warfare strives for something that seems to be very trendy in recent filmmaking, especially about war. What David Ehrlich called in his review of the film a dry verisimilitude. Dry is right. As opposed to more emotional war films, there's a sort of distance in Warfare between you and the characters. You could say that it succeeds in having an alienation effect, which was a technique used by Brecht to get his audience to be critical of what they're viewing, rather than wasting their time being immersed in the action. But that doesn't really happen with Warfare because, well, you don't have any time to think. It's still attempting immersion, just a sensorial immersion rather than an emotional one. So ultimately, I don't think it glorifies war any less than the other attempted anti-war movies we've discussed, because really, the film is all spectacle. And because it's made by A24, all aesthetics. Garland can't help but make a really good-looking film. Sontag writes, "A beautiful photograph drains attention from the sobering subject and turns it towards the medium itself, inviting the viewer to look aesthetically and thereby compromising the picture's status as a document. The photograph gives mixed signals. Stop this, it urges, but it also exclaims, what a spectacle." In my research, I focused a lot on films made about Vietnam and Iraq, two very unpopular and politically fraught wars, ones that have since been characterized as unjust. And so, these are the American movies you'd think would be the most anti-war, that they'd take on a vastly different tone than ones about, say, World War II, which play into that narrative of glory, that America stepped in and won against the Nazis. Although, let's be real, Soviet winter should get most of the credit there, but people aren't ready to talk about that one yet, I guess. I found that the films about Iraq were all aiming for, to some degree or another, that verisimilitude, using shaky cams and going for a grittier documentary look. Yet I myself resonated much more with the Vietnam films, which have a more political and sardonic, maybe even artful edge, and still manage to feel less propagandistic. They got me to think more critically about war than any of the Iraq films put together, including Warfare. Attempted anti-war movies are great at helping you understand what it actually feels like to be a soldier, how scary war really is. But at the end of the day, many of them, save for some Vietnam films, lack a more sociological reading of war, fail to outright condemn imperialism or even the military machines, which discards these soldiers once they return home, and therefore fail in their anti-war messaging. Ever since the McCarthy era, the American political machine has tried to intervene in the making of Hollywood films. But when 9/11 happened, things ramped up. Since then, the CIA and Department of Defense began to expand their editorial control over America's media output. They made their way into video games, television, and film. Screenplays for many movies like Captain Phillips, Transformers, and yes, your beloved Top Gun Maverick were actually supervised by the CIA and the DoD. The Top Gun sequel was actually created partially with the goal of recruitment in mind, since enlistment was at an all-time low. As of 2022, their fingers were in a whopping 2,500 Hollywood pies. Kathryn Bigelow's Zero Dark 30 is a particularly controversial one. It received a ton of accolades when it came out in 2011, but it was also criticized for portraying torture on the part of the American government as a necessary means to ending the war on terror, when the horrors that occurred in Abu Ghraib were by then widely known to the public. Zero Dark 30 and other films like it served to normalize and even endorse this kind of state-sanctioned violence, imperialism, and interventionism. They call this influence of the CIA and DoD in popular media the military entertainment complex. While most of the Iraq films I've discussed in this video are much more critical of the war than a film like Zero Dark 30 is, like I said before, these films refuse to deliver any explicitly political messaging. Peter Bradshaw even classified them as comprising a post-9/11 fence-sitter genre, and called them conscience-stricken films that invited us to sympathize with their liberal agony. They opt for an apolitical war is bad message, all the while never asking that important question: how are we to prevent war? Really, none of the movies I've discussed succeed in asking that question, whether it's because they're too preoccupied with spectacle, or pitying the poor soldier, or have become so caught up in the pursuit of objectivity that they become apolitical. And it's because, with the exception of All Quiet on the Western Front, which is the closest thus far to being truly anti-war, these are all Hollywood films. Ultimately, it's nearly impossible for Hollywood to make a real anti-war movie, because for one, it would go against the principles of classic narrative storytelling, catharsis of the passive spectator without any critical thinking, and also, the political implications would be massive. As Dayan Mustafa writes in his own amazing essay about the anti-war film, Western audiences can't discover that a society without war is possible, because that would mean the United States and other imperialist powers would have to lay down their badge and gun, resigning from their role as top goon squad for warmongering CEOs. And so instead, we engage in a process of manufactured consent, whether that's with direct military influence or not, to get the viewer to buy into the idea that war is a natural part of life. Mustafa then uses this incredible George Orwell quote: "The war is not meant to be won. It is meant to be continuous." But again, any sweeping statement about a concept as broad as the war film will always be more complicated than it seems. So going back to Truffaut's comment that any film about war ends up being pro-war, I disagree. The anti-war film does exist. Every movie I've discussed thus far is told from the perspective of the soldiers, and thus fail to encompass a holistic representation of war because they omit the most affected perspective of all, the perspective of civilians. There are actually a few methods that can result in solid anti-war messaging. Using allegory like Miyazaki did with Howl's Moving Castle to critique the war in Iraq, or being explicitly anti-imperial by using the perspective of insurgents, like how the Battle of Algiers spends most of its time with Ali Lapointe and other well-known figures of the FLN revolutionary movement, and ends with a triumphant shot of Algerians dancing defiantly in the street. But to me, the movie that is most airtight, most impactful in its anti-war stance, is told from the perspective of helpless civilians, who find themselves caught in the crossfire. War through the eyes of the innocent. One example is Come and See, Elim Klimov's 1985 psychological horror film about the Nazi occupation of Belarus in World War II. Rather than being told from the POV of a Nazi soldier or even a Belarusian partisan resistance fighter, the events of the film unfold instead through the eyes of a boy named Fliora, who attempts to join the partisans but is quickly left behind. The film instead sees Fliora helplessly thrust from one nightmarish situation to the next, befriending a girl named Glasha, who is clearly psychically damaged from the war and whose presence places Fliora in a constant state of confusion and terror. Discovering his actions have led to his entire village, including his mother and two little sisters, being executed, losing the partisan fighters he befriends one by one, and lastly, in the film's most disturbing sequence, witnessing a Nazi attack on a nearby village wherein the Nazis taunt and humiliate the villagers and then lock them into a barn, man, woman, and child, shoot at it, and set it on fire with everyone inside. Oh, and spare one woman only to violently assault her thereafter. The sense of dread and panic you feel while watching this is similar to that shower scene in Schindler's List, except this is a non-Hollywood film, so this time, no one makes it out alive. The film is explicitly political, featuring a moment where the survivors from Fliora's village make a clay statue of Hitler and spit on it, and ending with Fliora manically shooting at a picture of Hitler, intercut with rewind reels of Hitler's life. There are no sad or conflicted Nazis here, just brutes and savages. And on top of featuring the best performance by any child actor ever put to screen, Come and See does not bother to attempt objectivity. Foregoing any kind of documentary feel, it's actually heavily stylized. There's a very eerie filter cast over the film, even in a scene like this one, where Glosha dances giddily in the forest. This makes it so that when violence occurs, there's no way for it to rouse us. There's no momentum or choreography, just pure, unadulterated horror, seen through the eyes of a child who has no ability to stop it. Almost the entire movie takes place outside, and yet we never once see an ounce of sunlight. There's not a moment's reprieve, just unrelenting nightmare. We don't need combat. A scene of Fliora and Glosha frantically wading through the mud is sufficient in helping us understand and empathize with what most Belarusians likely felt during this period: helpless, tormented, frightened, and utterly hopeless. On the flip side, when Coppola was asked what an anti-war film would look like for him, he suggested a film about an Iraqi family who attend their daughter's wedding. Mustafa sees great meaning in this. He says, "Audiences in the West recognize Iraq only when it is subsequently followed by war. By severing the connection between the two and proposing that the film should be harmonious and peaceful, viewers are made privy to exactly what war steals from us: joy. Only then can a film be anti-war, according to Coppola." Which brings us to our final film, and the one that has stuck with me more than any other war film. One with little violence and no combat, but had me waking up in the middle of the night, crying. That film is Grave of the Fireflies. This Studio Ghibli movie by Isao Takahata is about Saita and little Setsuko, the two young children of an Imperial Japanese Navy captain who find themselves adrift after their mother is killed by an airstrike in World War II. They're first sent to be taken care of by their aunt in another village, but after feeling unwanted by her, Saita, the older of the two, decides to move himself and Setsuko into a nearby abandoned bomb shelter and become fully self-sufficient. This goes well for a time, but slowly his lack of maturity and life skills put a strain on their well-being, and their rations begin to dwindle. Over time, Setsuko begins to suffer from malnutrition, and in spite of Saita's tireless efforts to cure her, she dies. Eventually, as stated in the film's first scene, Saita himself dies of starvation as well, in a train station surrounded by other starving victims of the war. Takahata wanted viewers to take note of Saita's stubbornness, his pride in being chastised by his aunt, and his refusal to accept her support even as his sister dies before him. But with many scenes of townspeople callously dismissing the children's pleas for help, the film also explores the cold, every man for himself mentality that wartime brings out in people, that anyone can lose their humanity in times of survival, that childhood has no place in times of war. Why would anyone feel sympathy for Saita when boys so close to his age were dying on the battlefield? The movie is also political, often read as an allegory for imperialist Japan and even a direct exploration of Japanese culture at the time. The film is painfully detailed in its depiction of what children go through during wartime. We get intimate accounts of the food they eat every day, how they make it, how they wash their clothes, clean themselves, how they're impacted by the natural environment, riddled with bugs and covered in rashes. You want to reach into the screen and protect them, but the movie renders you, just like Fliora, helpless. Instead, we're forced to watch them meet a slow, painstaking demise. Seeing sweet little Setsuko breathe her final breath is one of the most harrowing scenes I have ever watched. Takahata insisted for years that Grave of Fireflies is not an anti-war film, viewing it more as a self-contained narrative of two children trying and failing to live an alternative lifestyle in a totalitarian society. But Death of the Author? I don't agree. I think it's the most powerful anti-war film to date. Beyond all the devastation, what I think makes Grave of Fireflies truly anti-war is that it adheres to Mustafa's hypothesis that a film can only be anti-war if it makes us privy to joy. For every terrible scene of the children suffering, there is a scene of them enjoying life, running on the beach, collecting fireflies, eating candies, and making each other laugh. The devastation of the film comes out of that juxtaposition of childhood innocence and wartime brutality. You would never care so much for Setsuko had you not gotten to know her in the good times, gotten used to her laughter. Amidst all the sorrow, we're taken aback at the children's resiliency, their ability to forget, to continue to seek joy. That's why, to me, Grave of the Fireflies is the ultimate anti-war film, because it builds for us a beautiful life, a life without war, and then takes that life away from us, sending us spiraling into an empty pit of loss. I think many of the films discussed in this video are trying to say something meaningful, and I think Warfare in particular, with its attempt to recreate real memories, speaks to the broader issue in our society of reintegrating vets, of taking care of them, and why people choose to enlist in the first place. Many different people will have different memories of the wars that the West has fought, and most of them will not be positive. And so, in this vacuum of remembrance, Hollywood steps in and ladens these tales with spectacle, bravado, catharsis, and, most devastatingly, a point of view. A point of view is the enemy of objectivity, because you know which side that POV was so often on, and it's often the side that won. The side that has the ability to remember, and the ability to forget all the people it tread upon to get there. So, the anti-war film is hard to achieve because, try as they might, sensational dramas tend to glorify violence, dry art films tend to erase the victims, and both tend to spend all their time pitying only the soldiers, forgetting that war is totalizing. It destroys everything in its path: nature, history, culture, people. So, what is an anti-war film? It's a film told from the perspective of the innocent, which sees war not as continuous or natural, but something that is unnatural, that obstructs our ability to live. Something that is good for no one except the few men who line their pockets with it. And lastly, the true anti-war film is a film you would never want to watch again. No chance at adrenaline, or excitement at accuracy, or even morbidity. Just loss. So, to conclude, the anti-war film does exist, just probably not in Hollywood. This video was made in partnership with Bellesa. Bellesa is a bi-woman company for all things spicy wellness. Their mission is to empower not only women, but everyone to embrace, explore, and celebrate their spicy side. And today, Bellesa and I are hooking you up. Anyone who signs up using their email will receive either a gift card or a free toy. Their toys like Pebble or Flutter Vibe are soft on the skin, ergonomic, and some of them are even multifunctional. Both of these toys come in their very own chargeable cases that kind of look like really elegant compact mirrors, so you can charge them discreetly on the go and no one would even think twice. These toys are amazing, and just skimming the surface of Bellesa's incredibly wide and diverse catalog of products, I could scroll forever on their website just browsing their endless array of offerings. So if you click the link in my description and enter your email address, Bellesa will send you an email to notify you about which gift you're winning. So either a gift card or a free toy. Ooh, the suspense. Special thank you to Syed Hassan, Melpertui, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, Edward U., Andrew Nguyen, Carolyn Stowe, Basil Ann, Connor O'Keefe, Gavin Borden, Sharma, Smith, Daniel Sardunas, Jenya, The Double Chip, Ryan Blythe, Lady Diane, Lotaire Roulan, Maya Kamaeva, Natalie Popper, Naomi Nakagawa, Burrow Fiddle, Lauren Woodring, Susie, Nathan King, Scott Barnett, William Elderfield, Julia Campana, Mr. Allen, Luis Eduardo Taroba, Sean Purnell, Danny Hall, Alexis, Nafis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, RSS, Thomas Dillon, Fridtjof Holstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.